everybody. Good afternoon. I'm Liz Cohen. I'm Dean here at the Radcliffe Institute, and I'm delighted that you're all here to join us this afternoon. Welcome to today's lecture by Michael Kimmelman on the politics of public space. Obviously, there's a lot of interest in that subject. One of the great pleasures and privileges of being dean at the Radcliffe Institute is that I get the opportunity to invite people to speak whose work I admire. Michael Kimmelman was at the top of my list because I love reading his writing in the New York Times, and also because the Radcliffe Institute has been very active lately in related areas. We have several fellows this year who are working in architectural history and urban studies, and we have made 3 other significant commitments to advancing research and teaching about the urban environment, and I'd like to just tell you quickly about them. First, we sponsor the Boston Area Research Initiative, which we call affectionately BARI, which is a collaboration with the city of Boston to foster cutting-edge urban research by faculty and students that then help shape public policy in the city. Second, we are partners with the Graduate School of Design and FAS on a multi-year project, which the Mellon Foundation is funding, to enhance humanities research and teaching about cities. And third, and closest to home, is Radcliffe's own experiment with enlivening public space by installing student-designed public art in our new Wallach Art Garden in Radcliffe Yard. You may have seen it as you came in from Brattle Street. Saturate the Moment, an ambitious sculpture designed by 2 students at the GSD, debuted in October. And we are now in our 2nd juried competition. So now it's my great pleasure to welcome Michael Kimmelman back to Harvard University, where he received a graduate degree in fine arts in 1982. Michael Kimmelman has been the architecture critic of the New York Times since 2011. He was formerly the paper's chief art critic, and he's also an accomplished pianist. Obviously, aesthetics matter deeply to him, as they should to an architectural critic. But I think what makes Michael Kimmelman such a brilliant analyst is his acute understanding that building a building or building a city is also a profoundly social and political process. When we read his columns, we learn not just about the strengths and weaknesses of a structure's design, but also about the multiple actors, including architects, clients, developers, public officials, and neighborhood residents, whose tastes, whose interests, and whose ideologies have all shaped the project's outcome. As a native son of New York, Kimmelman pays particular attention to how conflicts over public space and development priorities play out there. Anyone who cares about such recent controversies as the future of Penn Station or MoMA's plans for the Folk Art Museum next door knows that Michael Kimmelman can be depended on for careful, probing, and opinionated analysis. What I treasure most in his columns is his ability to combine appreciation for good design with a concern about what's good for people. And whenever possible, he seeks an alignment of these 2 goals. It's an added pleasure to have my friend and colleague, Mohsen Mostafavi, join me here today to introduce Michael Kimmelman from his perspective as Dean of the Harvard Graduate School of Design. Since assuming that position in 2008, Mohsen has not only made important innovations at the GSD, but he has brought the school closer to the rest of the university. The Radcliffe Institute's many collaborations with the GSD are replicated in most of Harvard's other schools. And most personally, as well as keenly relevant to our topic today, for the last 6 years and counting, Mohsen and I have been partners in an ambitious effort to enliven the public space of the Harvard campus as co-chairs of the Common Spaces Initiative. We started small by putting chairs in Harvard Yard. You may have noticed them. We then moved on to reimagining the Science Center Plaza, and now we are working with architects on turning Holyoke Center into the new Smith Campus Center that we hope will transform public life at Harvard. Throughout, Moisen has been incredibly generous with his time and his professional insight, and I have learned a tremendous amount from him. So it seemed only fitting that he should join me today to welcome Michael Kimmelman as he talks to us about the politics of public space. Moisen.
Well, good afternoon and welcome. I'm really delighted to be here and really want to thank Liz for bringing all of us together. I think Liz has done such a wonderful job of really using Radcliffe as a really significant venue and as a venue for gathering so many important people and bringing really the conversation to the Institute. So it's of course fantastic that Michael is here as part of that mission in a way. I think, Liz already mentioned something about Michael's role as a critic, and I think when we really think about the whole topic of criticism today, it's a topic that doesn't receive as much attention in the field of design and architecture as it used to. I mean, there used to be a time when, for architects, reading architectural magazines and reading criticism was a very important idea. Buildings were analyzed to an incredible extent, and I think we are very lucky still in the States to have a number of newspapers, New York Times, the Boston Globe, LA Times, that still really devote some serious effort and energy to this particular topic. But it is an area that has an incredible relevance. But we've seen, for example, an incredible growth in food and food criticism, but probably we haven't seen as much attention given to the field of buildings as much as we see given to food in a way. But what I've really enjoyed about Michael's contribution over the past few years, in addition to his role as an art critic and being so accomplished in music, is the way in which one could say that through his criticism, he deals with the topic of context. He really deals with context. In architecture, this word, for those of you who are not familiar with architecture, the word context is not always seen as a very positive thing because context can be viewed in many different ways. Sometimes this word context has been as a precursor, as a basis for developing contextualism and really seeing it as an idea of utilizing the reference to the formal qualities of a situation, of a context, in order to replicate that within an architecture that in some ways embodies that. I think with Michael, we see context utilized much more broadly. Context is seen as a situation, as a place where many of the themes that Liz mentioned, that you actually see a context, a place of relations, whether it's political, economic, and social come together. And it's that context that then really becomes the basis for the production of architecture. So without the discussion of context, for him, I think in many ways, architecture would be seen merely or purely as a formal enterprise, which really is not then seen in terms of the way in which it is placed within this broader situation and therefore becomes something that has its users, has an audience. And therefore this relationship with the audience of architecture becomes a significant part of the reciprocity between artifacts and in a way their users, their participants. And I think this is something which has been very critical in terms of how he's really opened up the column to move it much more closely to these broader social issues that then allow and enable us to deal with the city. Liz mentioned some of the themes and topics. I think the recent article that Michael did, I think it was the second one that you did, dealing, for example, with the Folk Art Museum. Those of you who know this building, you know that this is a really complicated project. It's sort of on one level, it's one of those projects where you can say perhaps there are no winners in some ways. It's a building that was built some years ago, a small building on a relatively small site by two really wonderful architects, Billy Chen and Todd Williams. But it's also a building where Billy and Todd managed to get a lot of architecture into that very small site. And at the same time, you know, there came MoMA and really trying to sort of see how this building fits into their kind of larger agenda. Now, this, I think, was a very tough situation, but I think I must say it was a brilliant piece that analyzed and understood the forces that were in play in terms of the history of this building's construction, in terms of the demands of the museum, in terms of the complications that are involved when you hire a firm of architects to pass judgment on the work of other architects, where they themselves are going to be potentially the architects that might do an architectural project. There are indeed a lot of political issues that are at stake in this particular project, but at the same time, there are architectural issues that are deeply embedded. And it was very, very moving to really see the way in which Michael managed to bring into the conversation many of those criteria, many of those concerns, and at the same time really try to give a reflection that was more about the ethics, if you like, of how one would participate in this kind of project. It raises for me, for example, serious issues actually in terms of the way in which commissioning happens, the way in which review processes occur, and things of that sort when it comes to the discussion of these kinds of projects that really affect all of us. I would say, in the context of today's presentation, it's no secret that I think this reference to situations has meant that Michael Kimmelman's focus has been on issues related to the public, to questions of the public, and of course the topic of public space. And I'm very delighted and very much looking forward to his analysis of bringing many of these themes together by discussing and presenting really the issue of public space from a political perspective. So please join me in welcoming Michael Kimmelman. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohsen, and thanks, Liz. It's really a great pleasure to be here, and a great honor too, and I'm happy to see so many of you today. And I'm happy afterwards, and I hope there will be time that we can open up the conversation to things that I raise here or not. I'm happy to talk about anything, including the Folk Art Museum and some of the subjects that Mohsen just raised after I'm finished. So to get here this morning, I left my apartment well before the crack of dawn, and crossed the street on which not a month ago, just a few blocks to the north, a 9-year-old boy holding his father's hand was struck and killed by a speeding taxi turning the corner at the changing light. That was one of several pedestrian deaths to make headlines, prompting New York City police to issue, of all things, a spate of jaywalking tickets, some 64 of them compared to 12 during the same period last year. A debatable response, let's say, since one could argue that the problems are the cars and streets that inhibit a pedestrian's freedom, not the pedestrians. That said, my journey here was clearly going to be safer on foot than it would have been had I driven, considering the dangers of the highway, especially in snow. So I walked across West End Avenue, skirted these heaps of snow and ice, the uncollected garbage and construction equipment obstructing the sidewalk, and arrived at Broadway, where, not today because of the snow, but usually a few people colonize the benches on the median. This is in better weather. They're always much more popular than one might imagine. and I descended to the subway, where the next train was due in 10 minutes, according to the electronic arrivals clock that for the last several years has been a belated, not always reliable, but critical addition to public life in New York City. Then, not quite half an hour later, at 34th Street, I disembarked into the bowels of Penn Station and dodged the usual clutch of depressed office workers and bewildered tourists, was staggering around in circles and lugging wheelie bags down these dank hallways, lost in what they clearly cannot believe is the gateway to a great city. And I headed to the windowless and unbearably sad waiting room we all know to check out the departures board for my train, anxiously, because having spoken with engineers and many others about the layout and architecture of Penn Station, suffice it to say that I am acutely aware of the place being just short of a Superfund site in terms of public safety, a death trap in waiting, where nobody in his or her right mind would spend a second more than absolutely necessary. I'm telling you something now, so take me up on it. The first light of day was still not there when the train pulled out of the underground and emerged near the Hudson River, where the tracks rise up along Riverside Park, and then again where they join the Hudson River Greenway. I will stop my morning recollection there, but I trust you register that every place I mentioned was public space. The streets, sidewalk, medians, subway platform, rail stations, parks, and riverfront. Politics determine the disposition of these spaces, their condition, the economy that creates them, the bureaucracy that oversees them, or enhances or diminishes them, and the neighborhoods shaped by them. In turn, these spaces, when activated by people using them, have an ability to shape politics, or at least temporarily affect the political conversation, which is why, post-Occupy, various authorities, usually in league with business interests, passed regulations curtailing the use of those public spaces. A law called the Anti-Social Behavior, Crime, and Policing Bill, now wending through the British Parliament, is intended to give district councils and police nearly unlimited abilities to restrict public activities based on the loosest definitions of infractions like annoyance and nuisance. So-called enhanced public space protection orders in Britain would grant authorities unilateral power to ban anything deemed detrimental to, quote, quality of life, which could include preventing certain groups or people from entering public spaces for periods of time. In New York, owners of the so-called privately owned public spaces like Zuccotti Park, where it used to be that only skateboarding, rollerblading, and bicycling were not permitted, worked with Mayor Bloomberg's administration after Occupy to impose new rules that prohibited tarps, sleeping bags, large packages, lying down, crowded walkways, and anything that, quote, might disturb others. So this is the old Zuccotti sign, and this is the new one, as you see, longer. Zuccotti had been occupiable, not only because there were few rules governing its public use, but also because it remained open 24 hours, unlike the city's public parks. As early as 1872, New York State passed a law requiring a permit for any gathering of 20 people or more in public. It would have been illegal for Occupy to camp out in a corner of the Great Lawn or Washington Square Park. Occupy had no permit. City officials are forever closing streets and parks for celebratory events like parades and street fairs, but try getting a permit to close a park or street for a political protest. That's because free speech, as Lisa Keller, the historian, has pointed out, is America's greatest pride and NIMBY. People say they believe in free speech, but then they want their streets and parks clear and quiet. So, where are the spaces in which we can speak out, and who designs and governs them? This is the first urban century in human history. The global population is estimated to be 7 billion. More people are now said to live in cities than don't. And the percentage of city dwellers is predicted to rise to 70 by 2050, the population to 8 billion. 1 billion people today live in informal settlements or slums. That number, too, is projected to double by 2030, almost triple by 2050. In the US, I've seen estimates of up to $52 billion in annual federal energy subsidies going to oil and gas industries. The number varies depending on the source, but in any case, dwarfing the combined subsidies for renewable fuels, ethanol, and nuclear power. We heavily subsidize suburban sprawl in the form of $500 billion annual in mortgage interest deductions, which partly explains why 68% of Americans still live in suburbs, despite a promising, and for the future of society, crucial revival of many downtowns. And we continue to build highways that are environmentally unsound and do nothing to reduce traffic, notwithstanding the photograph I happen to choose, while we live off nearly century-old public works triumphs of the WPA and cut or deny precious dollars to mass transit and high-speed rail. New Jersey's Governor Chris Christie, before his aides ordered a traffic jam at the George Washington Bridge, helped to derail a high-speed train tunnel under the Hudson, a long overdue step toward bringing transportation along the eastern seaboard of the United States into the 21st century. You may know that New York is soon to open a single new subway station for the number 7 line, the first and only new station in the city in decades. Shanghai inaugurated its metro in 1995, and so far has created a network of 300 miles with more than 300 stations. Even Madrid, during the last decade of economic turmoil, has completed dozens of new metro and light rail stations. But we remain a car nation, which shapes how we build our cities and towns. The designer Bruce Mau has calculated that 42% of all gasoline burned in cars goes for automobiles stuck in traffic jams. The price tag for a new light rail system is only about $1.4 billion or $70 million per mile for the one that now links Phoenix with Tempe and Mesa, Arizona, which has had great early success with its 32-station system. So there are counterexamples that show we can turn things around even in the heart of car country. Compare that $1.4 billion with $1 billion per week we've spent during the last decade in Afghanistan. China, meanwhile, is paving over vast swaths of the countryside so that during the next 12 years, 250 million Chinese will be moved from rural areas to newly constructed cities. The government has as a goal for 2025 that 70% of the country's population, roughly 900 million people, will be city residents. Half that number live in cities now. In other words, cities are the story of the century. How to build and sustain them, make them humane and economically, culturally vibrant places in which to live. This seems to me the big question for someone in my job as architecture critic, as it was for writers like Jane Jacobs, Lewis Mumford, and Ada Louise Huxtable, who set the bar. Public space, in turn, is central to civic health, inextricable from the goals of a more sustainable future and a more equitable society with its democratic imperatives, which is why disenfranchised masses often seek change through the physical occupation of public spaces. That said, too many cities around the world are growing not denser but larger, sprawling, by adding suburban-style gated subdivisions. That's what we are exporting. As the architect Vishaan Chakrabarty recently warned, housing, feeding, and transporting the world's growing population will deplete and destroy the Earth's resources if everyone adopts the same inefficient, unhealthy, and unsustainable living habits of much of the United States. He cites Dubai, Jakarta, Johannesburg, Rio, and Cairo, among other places, where gated, low-density communities linked by highways resemble parts of suburban Florida or Georgia. The historic connection between highways and suburban development on the one hand and class and racial divisions on the other is old news. Increasingly, outer ring suburbs are becoming our poor slums in America. In Cairo last year, on the other hand, I toured some of those gated residences with their golf courses built smack in the middle of the desert, places like Katamia Heights. And of course, it's not coincidental that Hosni Mubarak, the deposed Egyptian president, focused on highways and sprawl, virtually ignoring public transit and public spaces. He built, for example, the 6th of October Bridge and causeway linking Tahrir Square, downtown, with affluent suburbs like Nasr City and New Cairo. In a country where only 14% of the population owns cars, and where more than 20 million in Cairo have barely any green space, Mubarak attempted to fulfill his predecessor Sadat's vision of a modernized Egypt as a Middle Eastern version of post-war America with freeways, automobiles, and class exodus from the city. That is, Katamia Heights from above, and it is in the middle of the desert. So it was natural that the 6th of October Bridge, a public space like Tahrir Square, which after all is mostly a traffic circle, became the site of clashes between protesters and government forces during the revolution. And perhaps the most remarkable transformation I found to the city post-revolution was the do-it-yourself construction of a new on and off ramp attached to the ring road that Mubarak also constructed during the late 1980s, which purposely bypassed and thereby isolated Ard Aliwa, one of the city's largest informal settlements. Working-class residents of Ard Aliwa, in the absence of either help or interference by Mubarak's replacement, Mohamed Morsi, just took matters into their own hands and constructed the ramps out of dirt, sand, and trash, inviting the police to open a kiosk at the interchange afterward. I mean, do-it-yourself infrastructure, that's a new thing, yeah? I took this interchange. I can tell you it works. I can't tell you I felt great doing it, but it works. People buy cars and move to suburban gated communities in places like New Cairo because they want to get away from places like Ard Aliwa and believe the suburbs are safer than downtown, although, as I said earlier, killer drivers account for more deaths than any other killers in the world. Traffic injuries are the #1 cause of death among 10 to 24-year-olds globally. In the United States, some 40,000 people die on the roads every year, which is, as the journalist Charles Montgomery recently configured it, the equivalent of a loaded Boeing 747 crashing every 3 days, killing everybody aboard. A rational person, even in destabilized Egypt, might conclude it's safer to live in the city. And notwithstanding those deaths, in my own neighborhood, according to the mass transit advocacy group Transportation for America, New York ranks 50th among U.S. cities in terms of dangers faced by pedestrians. The National Institute of Health points out that pedestrian fatality rates drop as cities become more densely populated. Of course, safety depends on public vigilance, streets being made to serve people, not just cars, which requires people taking to those streets when they don't. So that's the idea behind Parking Day, which began in 2005. This is in Germany. With as many as 2 billion parking spaces in the United States, Americans have, by some accounts, put down enough asphalt to pave over 2 New England states, an estimated 8 parking spaces for every car. Cities need to revisit zoning codes that require the construction of parking spaces for new housing and commercial developments, and we should turn over construction of parking lots to the free market, not require them. Meanwhile, some Americans and others have been temporarily claiming these lots for farmers markets, hockey games, church services, as public spaces. Parking Day invites people to occupy these spaces for the day as they see fit. That's how these people saw fit. And people have devised pop-up medical clinics and wedding chapels, among other things. The idea has so far spread to 165 cities in 35 countries. Guerrilla urbanism has also inspired the parklets that are now official public policy in cities like Philadelphia, Los Angeles, New York, and San Francisco, where a neighborhood called Hayes Valley, for many years a poor and forlorn place under an elevated freeway, has been transformed. The Central Freeway, damaged in an earthquake, was demolished a decade ago. Residents petitioned the mayor to do something with the vacant lots left behind, so a competition was held, and a local architecture firm, Envelope A+D, run by Douglas Burnham, came up with Proxy, which entailed the installation of a kind of temporary evolving campus of modified shipping containers, hosting retailers, art galleries, restaurants, and cafes. There's a beer garden. This is what this is here. This whole thing, and here's the beer, and there's the sausages and pretzels. And they're also in very San Francisco way, there's a coffee shop where, I should say, here we are in Cambridge, it's the same, where you walk in and they have to tell you all about the coffee first. It takes about 15 minutes to get your cup of coffee, but there's a place to sit down and people gather in front of it and talk about their coffee. There's also an ice cream place, and that too is a kind of bespoke ice cream. A woman had gone around making this ice cream by herself, carrying, what is this thing called that freezes? Anyway, something incredibly dangerous, which was going to explode at some point. And she took over one of these containers, and therefore there was some regulation, and she makes this ice cream to order, meaning literally from scratch. She said, could I have some mint chocolate chip? And 20 minutes later, your mint chocolate chip is also made. But people really, actually it is kind of wonderful, people love it. And you can imagine local merchants feared that Proxy would steal their customers, but the project actually brought people to the neighborhood. Business boomed. A similar mix of infill urbanism and pedestrianization, of course, has fueled the Bloomberg Plaza program in New York City, which famously closed Broadway to cars at Times Square. Commercial rents there, by the way, have doubled since then. The citywide program invites neighbors to request that disused traffic circles, triangles, and streets be turned into pedestrian plazas. Not all of these have worked out for reasons I can explain later if you want, but when they do, it is top-down governance following bottom-up leads. So where the number 3 subway line ends at New Lots Avenue in the East New York section of Brooklyn, a coalition of local merchants and community leaders asked the Department of Transportation, which runs the program, to transform an especially nasty intersection that was trafficked by prostitutes and drug dealers. And that's what you see here, minus the drug dealers and prostitutes. That was this, and this is the end of the number 3 line. That's the subway coming down. And the city closed off this small street, as you see here, extended this area, put up some barriers, some potted trees, chairs, as at Radcliffe, and voila, crime has plummeted there, partly because the police have been more diligent, but also because residents have gained new ownership over the space. They use the space, they are there, they don't let it be taken over. At Madison Square Park in Manhattan, where Broadway crosses Fifth Avenue, a different kind of pedestrian unfriendly place, this was also turned into a pedestrian zone, or partly. Traffic patterns were changed, and they improved by reducing the traffic. But what really surprised people was how crowds elected to sit in the new plaza in the middle of the street rather than one of the most gorgeous parks in the city, Madison Square Park, over here. And a designer for a firm called Pentagram had said to me that, and his office is here, had said to me when he'd heard that they were putting a public plaza in the middle of the street across from Madison Square Park, he thought this was the most idiotic thing he'd ever heard of. Who in their right mind would sit in the middle of Fifth Avenue when you can go into this gorgeous park? Turns out millions of people do that. And it's worth contemplating why they do this, which Michael Beirut has contemplated as well. That's who it is. First of all, the view is good, right? The view's great. It's different than in the park. And I think it's also because people retreat from the city into parks, but plazas are in the middle of things, which is why crowds also gravitate to Trafalgar Square in London or the Piazza del Campo in Siena. It's why young professionals and empty nesters are recolonizing downtowns. rejuvenating old centers. We want to be in the middle of things. That's why we come into cities in the first place, or one of the reasons why. Someone said to me the analogy was when you go to a dinner party and everyone hangs out near the kitchen drinking a beer because that's where all the traffic is. You don't just hang out in the living room where everything has been made clean and orderly, but nothing's actually happening. I think it's a good analogy, actually. Now, other progressive cities have focused political, architectural, and economic capital on reforming public space in different ways. And a classic model that as often comes up is Medellin in Colombia, which has sponsored in recent years architectural and infrastructural projects to improve parks and slums by adding libraries, a metro and cable car system, public squares, and new parks. And the city has turned around. The improvements there are still fragile and fractional. We can talk about those afterwards as well. But areas formerly stigmatized have become tourist attractions. And this raised the point that I mentioned before. This is instilling pride in residents as well, and a sense of civic equity. In the formerly derelict and dangerous botanical garden, which used to be the city's central park, the Orchideorama, as you see here, is a good example of the focus on public space and public architecture, a towering wood canopy above a grand patio, designed by two young local firms, JPRCR Architects and Plan B Architects, winners of a competition the city devised to advertise Medellin's talent and recuperate a critical public space in an important neighborhood. I grew up in Jane Jacobs' neighborhood, Greenwich Village, so much of what she wrote about cities, streets, and sidewalks was in my bones, second nature for me. And from the time I was a small boy, I started to read the newspaper, and then as a teenager, Ada Louise Huxtable was the critic I read for the Times, someone whom I would get to know. She died sadly last year. After I took over the architecture critic's job in 2011, late in 2011, I wrote about branch libraries in Queens, thanks to another Bloomberg initiative called the Design Excellence Program. And Ada Louise sent me an email. These projects, she said, are clear visual demonstrations which people need in order to understand how a high standard of architectural design and the refusal to go with hackwork can have very real and sometimes unanticipated social, human, environmental, and neighborhood consequences, often in parts of the city that need it so badly and that we hear so little about. For me, in terms of models, there were Jacobs, Huxtable, and Mumford. By the way, this is the inside of that library in Queens. This is Mumford's column, the skyline for the New Yorker magazine. Mumford's Emersonian approach to architecture and urbanism aimed toward moral reform. The good life, he suggested, involved more than redistributing wealth. It entailed an almost religious refashioning of values based on an ecological view of the city. Life, seen whole in all its variety and interconnectedness, was physically expressed in a healthy and natural configuration of built forms in the city. The right to have access to every building in the city by private motor car in an age when everyone possesses such a vehicle is the right to destroy the city, he wrote. The art of architecture, as he put it, required not just making attractive buildings, but making what he called a new home for man. And the chief mission for architects was to shape their work according to the social, psychological, and physical needs of human beings. Mumford also grew up in New York. He explored distant corners of the city. He wrote in a memoir about the poverty he found as a young man investigating the Lower East Side. The absence of space, order, intelligent design, even sunlight and fresh air, he said, the sense of all human qualities that were missing, taught me by contrast what to demand in every work of humane architecture. Coming back to America to be the architecture critic after some years in Berlin, where I was based, writing a column I had devised linking culture and society across Europe and the Middle East, I had a chance to see New York as a clean slate. Like Mumford, I made it my job to explore far-flung parts of it, which I'd never seen before, because architecture wasn't only happening in Manhattan. To see a city with fresh eyes and to get paid to do that is an incredible gift. I returned to America with a model of the European social contract in mind, believing that there was an appetite for a broader conversation about the built world, and that the Times provided a kind of common ground for many of those with a stake in that conversation, meaning politicians, engineers, transit specialists, money people, developers, environmentalists, landscape designers, social service agencies, academics, artists, water management experts, architects, city planners, mothers, fathers, students. I felt that architecture wasn't merely an extension of the art world, it was about how we live, so it should matter to everybody. Many people who shared urban and architectural interests and goals turned out not to know that they shared these interests. So I came to realize that social and architectural progress depended on revealing these people to each other, and in so doing, promoting coalitions for change. Let me end with two examples of what I mean: Penn Station and the Occupy movement. Penn Station is one of the busiest and most important public spaces in the Western world, and, as I alluded to earlier, one of the worst. A station used by more than 500,000 commuters a day, whose appalling dungeon-like condition, the consequence of perhaps the most notorious urban renewal failure of the 20th century, which has given us Nacho Libre, among other things, stems from the presence of a single privately owned building on top of it, this very beautiful arena, Madison Square Garden. That's irony, in case any of you out there are not sure. When I got back from Berlin, I tried to catch up on all sorts of things, and so started to ask about the station, which I had heard, where I'd heard something had been cooked up for it called the Moynihan Plan, and everybody told me it's a done deal, and that moving the garden is a dead subject, so don't waste my time. By the way, I couldn't resist just including this photograph. The urban renewal failure was, of course, the destruction of Penn Station to do this, which interestingly had many justifications at the time, speaking of the Folk Art Museum, which in retrospect maybe don't seem like the right priorities. But I included this photograph to show you the protests against its demolition then, because that's Jane Jacobs, and that's Philip Johnson. So I was told, don't waste my time, but it really helps to be dumb. So I asked, what exactly is the Moynihan Plan? And the plan, which everybody, almost everybody in New York, as far as I could gather, had assumed meant moving Penn Station, lock, stock, and barrel, across 8th Avenue into the McKim-Mead white-designed Farley Post Office. This is the other side of 8th Avenue. And here's the gardens, which everyone assumed was just moving there, problem solved. I discovered it actually moves only Amtrak, which accounts for some 30,000 riders a day, or perhaps 5% of all those who use Penn Station. And that's where Amtrak would be, inside Farley. So then I began asking, well, what else could be done? What sticks and carrots might be available to get the garden to move? And in pressing for sticks, I asked whether the garden owned the land it was on, and discovered that no, it held a 50-year special permit, which, as chance had it, was soon to expire. Although this was not on the radar of any city official, and no one thought it was or could be a tool for change. But there was an election looming. I also looked for carrots, so proposed providing the owners of the garden with a brand new arena elsewhere on the west side, really just to kindle a new conversation about the station and to encourage a line of thinking in terms of the greater public good. What I realized from the start was that Penn Station was the most intractable site in the city because of all the different parties involved: federal, state, and local, private, and public, and that previous discussions about its improvement had been siloed. Design people talking to each other, transit people to themselves, developers to themselves. So progress depended on everyone talking to each other and talking to everyone, providing common ground for a conversation in which everyone felt they were represented at the table. At the same time, spreading awareness of the station as a public priority, a democratic space whose improvement should be a basic responsibility in an equitable society. Long story short, with a lot of nudging and complaining, the city council was persuaded to prevent, in effect, a permanent and irreversible land grab by the garden, which would have forever ended the chance for change. And instead, the council limited the permit and requested a plan for relocating the building and improving the station. So the ball has now moved, after half a century, from the end zone to the 2-yard line. All the hard work is ahead. But the potential benefits are enormous, not just for millions of commuters, but for the whole region. And I think this is crucial to understanding the value of public space. I've alluded to this in a few other cases already. Let's look at King's Cross in London. It shows how upgrading a train station, or in that case, 2 stations, can lead to profound social and economic gains. The site is where the King's Cross and St. Pancras rail stations converge. So this was long a locus of seemingly intractable poverty and crime. And now the neighborhood has been transformed through a mix of public and private investment in the rail stations and public spaces around them, which in turn have attracted new housing, an arts university, and Google, which chose to locate its European headquarters at King's Cross. King's Cross has become a boon to local property values and the city's entire economy, as well as a Europe-wide emblem of innovation. As for Occupy Wall Street, it proved that no matter how instrumental new media have become in spreading protests these days, nothing has replaced people physically sharing public spaces. The revolution in Egypt, after all, happened not online, but in Tahrir Square and on the 6th of October Bridge. I've gone to see the protests in Gezi Park in Istanbul and in Rio. In all these cases, physical space revealed protesters to each other, as well as to the rest of the world. Middle-class Brazilian protesters who only encountered favela residents as laborers and servants shared the streets with them on equal footing, suddenly tethered by the bonds of discontent. Imagine Zuccotti Park, a protester there told me, as a Venn diagram of characters representing disparate political and economic disenchantments. The park is where their grievances overlapped. It was literally common ground. And I would add that I don't think it's coincidental that these strangers who came together at Zuccotti and Gezi and other places like them all formed pop-up towns on these sites, producing what they imagined to be the outlines of a fairer city, with kitchens serving free food, legal services, sanitation department, libraries, medical stations, media centers, and general stores. Occupiers tend toward places like Zuccotti and Gezi, places that can look jammed and bustling with a few hundred people in them. Think about it, the same crowds in Central Park would look puny, and these places carry meaning. I think it came up earlier today as a question at lunch, is there something that ties together many of these places? Zuccotti is a small, relatively small park surrounded by buildings. It's like a stage in the round, and it provided, therefore, a perfect location for the presentation of something to a public and to media, which could surround the space and invade it like going onto a stage. And this was true in other places as well. It was true, in fact, in its way of Gezi Park, which is not down, but raised and yet is an isolated space. And much of the protest in Gezi was limited within Gezi. A lot of it didn't spill right outside. Gezi, and here's one of the libraries at Gezi, by the way. Gezi is at Taksim Square, whose urban character, fluid, irregular, open, and unpredictable, reflects the area's historic identity as the heart of modern multicultural Turkey. This was where poor European immigrants settled during the 19th century. It was a honky-tonk quarter in the 1980s, a haven to gays and lesbians, a locus of nightclubs, foreign movie palaces, and French-style covered arcades. Gravestones from an Armenian cemetery at Taksim were demolished in 1939 and said to have been used to construct the stairs at Gezi Park, a Republican-era project by the French planner Henri Prost that is as modern as are the jumble of high-rise hotels, traffic circles, and the now shuttered opera house that surrounds it. This is what made it a target of the ruling regime. Prime Minister Erdogan triggered the protest by threatening to redo Taksim as, in effect, a neo-Ottoman theme park, undoing what one Turk described to me as the unruly commons in the middle of the city. So the conflict over public space, in that case, openly pitted control versus freedom, segregation versus diversity, order versus messiness and serendipity. The most effective public spaces are, to some extent, indeterminate, ambiguous, messy. The fact that Gezi was shambolic only made it more potent as a center of gravity for protesters. Can we design such spaces for protest? I don't think so. They arise from circumstance. They must be enacted, to borrow the term of Geoffrey Howe, who contrasts insurgent spaces with institutional ones, like Starbucks or Yankee Stadium. Spaces that promote democracy must be open. A healthy city has a robust diversity of public spaces, and I think it's not by chance that, say, some sheikhs in the Gulf don't commission loads of sidewalks, squares, and parks in their cities where people might gather. How effective is political protest in public space? I don't want to leave you with too rosy a picture. This is from Gezi. Ultimately, tanks trump tents. That's the hard truth of Egypt today. But it's also too early to say that Tahrir had no impact, since revolutions can take years, sometimes generations. The civil rights protests and racial unrest of the 1960s and 70s in this country can be said to have paved the way for the election of the first African-American president in 2008. In Turkey, the protests have clearly rattled a regime that seemed unshakable, and the reverberations, I think, are still being felt. In New York, Occupy made the 1% a household term and contributed to the inordinately tall Mayor Bill de Blasio's election victory with its tale of two cities. I suspect what most politicians and private developers took away from the Occupy movement was that in future, they need to work harder to design spaces that can't be occupied. But I think another lesson is that millions and billions of people dream of opportunity and equality, and that those dreams will be contested or expressed in the public spaces we build for each other and ourselves. Thank you.
Mr. Kimmelman, I'm Todd Larson, and I think an example of a space, public space that was designed for protests or at least public gatherings was City Hall Plaza in Boston. Mm-hmm. In fact, I.M. Pei laid that out specifically to promote the democracy of public gathering. And as far as a protest venue, at first it appeared to work when there was that anti-busing protest of September 1974, when that crowd chased Senator Ted Kennedy into the JFK Federal Building and smashed that big pane of glass. Mm. You know, even though in recent years it hasn't been used as much for protests, mainly victory gatherings for the Red Sox World Series win or the Patriots Super Bowl victory or the Bruins Stanley Cup wins in the past few years. What do you think of City Hall Plaza in terms of its effectiveness as a public protest space, given that it was, at least in part, designed for that?
It's an interesting question, also because City Hall is not a particularly popular building architecturally, although is that a fair way to put it?
Yeah.
So you raise an interesting question. What I was asking was slightly different. It's not that do we design spaces for protests. Look, Erdogan in Turkey is designing a public plaza that is going near a rail station on the south side of the city, on the water, that is effectively for protests. That's not quite the same as saying the places that are occupiable, which must require some, as I said, some insurgent action, best designed by someone for that purpose. I think the answer is no. I think that it is the tension of occupying a space not intended to be occupied that creates the friction that activates protests like Gezi or Occupy. I mean, Occupy was in a very, Zuccotti was in a very curious position because, as I said, the park didn't at that time have rules. It is, in fact, a privately owned space. Had it been public, it wouldn't have worked. Nobody had thought that that was a place you'd gather. Hyde Park, by contrast, a Speaker's Corner in Hyde Park, there are constantly people talking there. I don't think anybody listens. So, it's not that spaces can't literally be designed for them. It's whether those spaces can be designed for an effective forms of protest. And that's just a question I put out there, but I find it hard to imagine what that would be. And the highway is a good example, too. I mean, there always needs to be some space that causes a disruption or some rupture, really. So a highway is the ultimate space that one can occupy. Well, that's just because it's dangerous to do.
Hi, I'm Winnie Brinus. We met before.
Yep.
One thing I was thinking about when you were talking was campuses. Having been a student radical a long time ago in the 60s and 70s, I was thinking about the space when you were speaking about how protest, starting with the free speech movement, but how protest was in some way protected and fostered by the campus itself.
Right.
I just wanted to
No, it's a very
mention
good point. And again, so it's part of the issue about protest is that to the extent it is protected and contained, well, containment is an important, I think a very important thing, as I said, for the concentration and the observation of those protests. But contained, but it has to somehow spill out into society that does not want to, wishes to have it contained.
Right.
So campuses are a complicated space for that to happen. Obviously, the protests in '68 and '69 were so disruptive in the campus here and in Berkeley and Columbia, wherever else, that it had an effect outside itself. Someone here has the answer, but when was the last time there was such a protest like that on a campus like this? Do we have to go back to 1969? It's an interesting. Yeah. True, but how much of the yard was closed as a result? The whole yard. For a long time? Forgive my not knowing this, I wasn't here. For weeks. Well, that's pretty good. Yeah. But it's interesting, it's my ignorance too, but it's interesting, I raise it to you, that isn't necessarily one of the places that people talk about. Nothing against Harvard, but but it isn't, right? People talk about Zuccotti, they talk about London and so forth, and I think maybe, again, it has to do with the isolation of a university.
Hi.
Hi.
My name is Han Chao Lu. I'm a fellow here at Radcliffe. Just a question regarding the function of public square in former Soviet Union. The Red Square used to be a rally place for government mobilized rally demonstrations. And Tiananmen Square, we all know that has these political functions. So you are talking about, today, you're talking about the public square function as civil societies or the democratic gathering place. But it's also used used for totalitarian regimes. So I wonder
Absolutely, yeah. But isn't that exactly what made the protests in Tiananmen so effective, so important, was precisely the occupation of a space which had been assigned another kind of meaning. The same would be true in Red Square, of course, although I don't remember, in the Occupy days that there was the same occupation of Red Square. But I agree. It's the tension between the public space, in that case, a large public space, the architecture of the space itself, its size, is an expression of the grandeur and ambition of the country, though the regime has changed depending on in the country. But yes, it was an official place. I'm trying to think what the same is in America, and I suppose you would say the Washington Mall, which, after all, has been effectively occupied by protests repeatedly, including in the civil rights movement. So, I mean, I think those spaces are quite effective, precisely because they are the places of official power. Does that make sense to you? I mean,
Yeah, sure. Actually, right now in China, in particular, the government try to shrink the public space.
to try to,
You make it smaller.
yeah, to shrink. Yeah.
They build buildings in middle of the
Right.
public square.
Right. Well, this was true in Red Square, and it's certainly true in the reaction of the Morsi regime after the revolution in Cairo. I can say that many streets were closed, blocked off. Places that had been used by protesters were methodically closed off so that the people could not do what they did to Mubarak's regime, to Morsi's regime. Of course, the tanks are an entirely different matter. They weren't thinking of the army. They were thinking of public protesters. So yes, the idea of shrinking that space or closing it off, that's crucial. And I think it wasn't a passing remark about, for instance, the Gulf states, where it's very clear to me that you have the design of spaces without spaces that define themselves to be occupied. The absence of sidewalks and just squares and so forth means that there's a kind of nowhere space. Dubai is entirely nowhere. There's nowhere in Dubai except the malls. So I guess you can occupy the malls.
Okay, all right, thank you.
My name is David Rush. I'm a very brief comment. Fred Wiseman's latest film is called At Berkeley, and the spine, the armature around which it's built, is a protest in front of Sperl Hall.
Yeah.
So
I've heard it's great, yeah.
It's not only great, but it shows you the response building with the police, the deans, because he had, I guess, pretty much free access to the entire place. So look at it, because it's a test case for what you're talking about.
Very interesting.
It was a very inchoate protest. It
Yeah.
wasn't a very coherent protest, but it showed all the things you're describing.
I think, Zuccotti, one of the things that happened about the Occupy movement, thank you, was that the criticism, as you recall, was this doesn't make sense. There are a lot of people, it's not clear what their message is, except there's inequality and income disparity. But there are 1 million people with, grievances. What is the point of Zuccotti? And I think when you physically went there and you saw that what they were creating was this little town in this space, and so that the space itself became a representation of their idea of a society in which people got along even though they had different interests, that you realize that the point of Occupy was not so much that it had a single message like the anti-war protest, but that it was about the meeting place of lots of different overlapping interests. That's why I kept referring to common ground. And I think we need to look at the physical manifestation of these protests in a way to understand their meaning more than we need to hear what they announce as their own point. Because, yes, it's true, after a while, the message was the 1%. But in the beginning, as you recall, there were 1 million messages coming out of it, and it just looked like a bunch of people who hadn't gotten their act together. I don't think that's true when you were on the site. I thought it was actually quite coherent until it wasn't, which happened after a while, yeah.
You've spoken about many things that are extremely interesting, and you began by talking about pedestrian transportation and environmental justice and parts of the city that don't have the same things as wealthier parts of the city. And then ended with talking about these large public spaces that people can congregate in. And a couple of things are happening in both Boston and Massachusetts that I think are kind of interesting. One of them is that there has been, you also talked about things coming from the grassroots and affecting how government ends up doing things because of pressure from below. And in Boston, there have been a huge number of trail projects in the past 25 years that are using old railroad right-of-ways and also an ancient colonial rule that gave citizens the right to fish or fowl, F-O-W-L, along the waterfront. And that was the basis for being able to develop the Harbor Walk along Boston. And all of these trails, and some of them have been result of advocacy by a group called the Boston Natural Areas Network that has done 2 trails with no money of their own, but by advocating for trails in East Boston that had very little open space that connects Boston Harbor to Winthrop through an old railroad line. And what's happened is, and this ties in with the places that you can have protests, that these trails end up connecting large public spaces to each other. So people with no money can walk or bike to all different parts of the city that they weren't able to walk or bike to
Let me interrupt
before.
you, and thank you for that. I mean, I'm grateful. I mean, you mentioned a couple of things for which I'm especially grateful. One is this bottom-up process. I began, I sort of anticipated that everyone here might think I would just talk about Occupy, and so, but I wanted to say that I think the politics of public space is about the larger way we think of cities, and whether we begin to think about the way we design our cities first from public interest rather than through opportunistic private development. And that is a political matter. It's not just about occupying a space. These are all connected. And so your point about the interconnectedness of these public spaces, claiming the city, is not so much about protest. It's just about creating an ordering of priorities that have to do with equity and as well as environmental concerns and so forth. So I'm grateful you pointed that out.
Yeah, and the last thing I was going to say is the Occupy Boston demonstration happened on a public space developed by the Big Dig.
Yeah.
And I think the reason it was there was because it was so accessible for people walking and taking public transportation.
Right. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Lajos Hader, and when I was in high school in Budapest, Hungary, I was part of a large Occupy process there, which ended with tanks, and many of those actually did, Tiananmen Square and others, and the ones that don't end with tanks seem to end with the trash piling up and the bourgeoisie reasserting itself and pretty much closing the thing down, and the people who are there get tired, get run out of energy and get tired.
Yeah.
The other part that you showed, which is, I think, interesting, is those very small things with the parking areas and so on. But my question really is, having spent my life really thinking about, both as an artist and as an urban designer, about how to cash in on these things. Mm-hmm. How do you keep these things from fading out after 3 months, 2 weeks, a year, or whatever, and actually feed them into the real political process, the one that prevails?
Yeah.
And how does that, in fact, translate into important change?
So,
I mean, it does somehow, but how?
Yeah, so at the end, I mean, I wanted to be clear. As I said, I think tanks trump, tents in Tahrir. And the Hungary and Prague is a very interesting case. Of course, that was extremely short-lived. It's a complicated question to answer because, after all, Occupy came apart pretty quickly. We can get to the larger issues of tanks in Hungary and in Egypt as well in a second. But I mean, I think there are to presume Tahrir is a very exceptional case, right? It's very rare that an occupation like that, an act of protest, actually topples the government. But I do think that there are ways in which things enter into a public discourse that can cause things to happen over a period of time. Now, it's an argument whether or not 20 years can pass. I mean, I mentioned somewhat provocatively civil rights protests in the 60s and 70s. But I mention it only because I think most of us here would agree that the civil rights process in this country has been a long one, and it's not over, but that some of the seeds were, planted in the 60s and 70s for the election of Obama. I leave it to you to say whether there was any effect whatsoever of the protests in '68 in Hungary and Prague. But I would venture to say that there probably were, though they did not immediately cause change there. So, I mean, I guess it's to do somewhat with expectations. I don't think that one having an endless protest or a space for that protest is the thing. It's not the end in itself. It isn't the thing. The question is, what goals does one have with this? And to me, it has a lot to do with changing the conversation, making clear certain ideas are out there shared by other people, and one cannot then control exactly what happens. It's true that, ultimately power will rest with those who bear the strongest arms, but not forever. I mean, I don't know how else to put it.
The short answer is yes, there were many effects in various complicated ways. One of them is that I'm here.
Exactly.
Thank you.
I was actually going to say that, but I mean, I think that's probably not uncommonly true.
My name is Jim Marshall, and I just wanted to mention what happened in Wisconsin at the Capitol last year.
Yeah,
Went on for quite a long time,
it's true.
and the outgrowth of that is a reaction for what's been going on in North Carolina at the Capitol, the Moral Mondays. It's went on all through the summer,
Yeah.
and on Saturday there's going to be a demonstration again at the Capitol, bringing together 50,000 people. There's also a Moral Monday movement in Georgia, and a Truthful Tuesday movement in South Carolina. But the
Wishful Wednesday.
the idea is to rebirth the movement. A lot of people like myself who've been involved in the 60s are getting involved now to try to overcome what's happening with the Republican legislatures, which are suppressing the vote or trying.
The thing is, thank you for that. I mean, none of you picked up this here, but I do think it is an important fact that revolutions have happened before. I lived in Berlin. I mean, the wall did not fall because people were tweeting about it. Most people didn't even have a telephone in East Berlin, and I think there is a role that is played by new media, social media, in protest. But I think it's a very powerful message that we've seen in recent years of the physical occupation of space by relatively few people having a disproportionately large effect. And the reason has partly to do with, as I said, people revealing them to each other and to the world, but also the fact that people are really putting themselves out there and for others to see. There's a way in which that act itself, which involves some risk, but in any case involves some physical effort to which everyone can relate. I think that I don't think any form of tweeting or Facebook is sharing is going to supplant. You mention all these things, and the numbers are 50,000. I mean, there are probably 50 people in this room who have more followers than that on Twitter. But relatively speaking, that in itself is not going to move the dial politically. But 50,000 people gathering in Georgia, gets talked about here. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi. First, I want to thank you for your talk. I really learned a lot and
Thank you.
appreciated the questions that you raised. I wanted to ask how you see the frontier of utilizing space and strategically raising issues using space advancing, given the institutionalization in America, especially of using space and the common strategy of protesting or taking to the streets in a way that now has become institutionalized with permits and so on and so forth, that seems to have lost the power of utilizing space that it once did when the strategies were first utilized.
Well, look, I mean, again, you're talking about creating spaces for protests, and I'm talking about public space in a larger sense, and that seems to me if we can't necessarily design spaces that are effective for protest, there's something inherently contradictory about that. We can think in terms of designing our cities, our buildings and the spaces between them to enhance equitability and improve the general public good. And that's something that designers and architects cannot do on their own. It is not simply the responsibility of government, but it is something that a coalition of interested and able people, which includes, I think, public servants, private industry, which, as I tried to say here several ways, benefit from this, and architects and designers have a crucial role in determining in the future. It's a question of whether we see, as Moisen put it, the buildings as existing independently or in the fabric of the city and in a larger context, and then thinking of the spaces we design around them as having some responsibility to the public at large. I think that's really what it's about, where it's not about creating a Zuccotti Park, which people devise. If Zuccotti Park had been designed for this purpose, it would never have been occupied.
Hello there. My name is Ron Malice, and first of all, I just want to say I wish you would hang around here for a couple of years. Just be here. I want to take a slightly different take, slightly different take on the politics of public space. This is an example, and one of the key people involved in this project is in the room, as I discovered via texting. It has politics, it has public, and it has space. There's an area in Roxbury called Bartlett. It's 8.5 acres. That's going to be redeveloped into a mixed-income neighborhood. But this past summer, it was essentially turned into an art yard with street art, graffiti art, performances, whatever. It was an incredible adaptive reuse, and I think everything you've been talking about, in a way, is an adaptive reuse.
Absolutely.
But it was an adaptive reuse of this particular space. And I think we have to keep in mind not only the protest aspects of what public space provides opportunities for that, but also what it provides for the public that is also politics, and that engages people in ways, they may never have been engaged before. There were folks coming into that. There was an older guy with a little kid, probably grandfather, grandson, walking in and sort of saying in their various ways, "What the hell is this?" and becoming part of it.
Right.
It's critically important, it seems to me, to incorporate that into any kind of discussion about the politics of public space.
Well, I agree. And if you go to a city like Cairo and you see there's basically one park, mostly privately paid for, I'm forgetting the name, someone here will remember, one really beautiful green park, you'll see how it has become a kind of magnet for all sorts of people who don't have any other recourse. That the power of that space, also the civilizing power of that space, is just incredible. And these spaces, by the way, if you think about wandering through most cities, it isn't that there's a central park or a Hyde Park that matters most. It's often the small interventions that make huge differences, because not everyone's going. I grew up in the village. I didn't go to the Central Park very much, but I had little places that were important to me, and my local park, which was Washington Square Park. So, the kinds of things we're talking about are often on a small scale. That's why I think the parklets are an interesting little thing. Taking back this incredibly precious curbside space and, claiming it and just providing a few places to sit. They don't work very well on the whole, but the principle behind them is, I think, quite interesting. And it doesn't take much. They can be a space for an artwork. They can be a space for just, a couple of benches. Someone put a miniature putting green on one of them. It's fun. Kids come play. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Anne-Marie Lubinow. I'm director of the Rudy Bruner Award for Urban Excellence. Mm-hmm. And given your comment that cities are the story of this century and your observations on the social and political implications, I'd be curious to hear your comments about the implications on the role of the design professional and the educational institutions like Harvard and the GSD.
I love Harvard and the GSD. It's fabulous. Yeah, look, there's a complicated question because First of all, I wasn't a student at the GSD. I was getting a degree in art history. So I can't claim to have gone through that process, and I'm not an architect. And it is wrong to put too much of the burden on architects for large-scale social change. And architects have many ambitions and interests. This is all a long caveat that is not a throat-clearing thing. I mean, I think that there are many reasons why architects have interests other than in, say, the improvement of public space. That said, let me just say one thing, which might be the answer to for which you're looking. So what I said when I came back and thought that there was an opportune moment was, conversations in fields, they have moments that when they're vibrant, and then they have moments when they begin to peter out. And for various reasons, they're intellectually sort of run their course. If they play out in the real world, there may be economic reasons. And I think there has been abroad a conversation about architecture which has seen it in a very limited way. And that conversation had a lot of traction for a number of years because, A, it gave architecture a new kind of prominence. It inspired interesting commissions and all sorts of formal and material inventions. But it also, I think, gave the public a perception of architecture, not necessarily one shared by architects, but certainly ones from which architects benefited and that the public came to assume, which was that architecture was a purveyor of luxury goods and produced a form of sculpture that was of limited interest outside itself or to those people who had access to those projects. And I think this is a profoundly unfair representation of what architecture historically is about, what its ambitions of its its finest architects, practitioners are, and I think it has corrupted to some extent the perceptions of a public about what role design can play. So, yes, I think architecture schools, especially like Harvard at the forefront, are in a position to encourage architects to play a much larger role, as large a role as they can, in reclaiming a social responsibility and seeing themselves as people who are uniquely equipped to help in that conversation. I think on some level, the failures of the urban planning, urban renewal movement in the mid-century and the criticism of modernism that sort of that produced all sorts of reactions in the public, limited architects. Architects, in a sense, almost chose to limit themselves. Even I was talking at lunch with some kids at the GSD. I think they even the pay structure of architects, in which they get a fee for doing a very narrow thing, and their liabilities are limited, but in a certain sense, they're not supposed to play a larger role. I think architects and designers should be playing a larger role again, and to be able to claim that role is a good thing. I think there were all sorts of reasons why that kind of top-down view of architecture and design of the mid-century failed. But that doesn't mean architects just retreat to making museum extensions and luxury apartment towers. There's a big space in between.
I'm Myron Miller, actually an architect who did graduate from the GSD in an era, the late 60s, early 70s, when the consideration of the public domain and the public responsibility and involvement of citizenry was really the dominant attitude that I think influenced students and faculty.
Yeah.
But I had two somewhat separate points out of the topics we've been talking about. One, it seems there may be a lesson for urban planners and designers and city administrators and politicians that in doing major redevelopment, it's always important to leave some parts unfinished,
Yeah.
Open for other interpretations. One of the reasons why the Occupy movement was very successful in Boston on the space near Dewey Square where it was actually a space that was left over because of a failed project, not building the garden under glass that, like many things on the Greenway, never could get funded.
Right.
But that's what left things that could become the focus for the activity, the living there, and the congregation of people around that.
Yeah.
And maybe that can be built into the thinking about how projects get implemented.
Right, I love that thought. It's what I meant before by ambiguous, messy, indeterminate spaces. I agree with that exactly. It's hard to figure how one does design them, but I think that's exactly right, that the act of occupation enacts the space. It completes it in a way, but it can be completed in different ways. Yeah, it's absolutely true.
The other different type of topic, but also related to Occupy, is it seems to me that there's a sort of a limited term that the actual occupation can have a benefit. And what matters in making it a productive as opposed to not necessarily a meaningful event is the coalitions that get built. You point out that the people putting themselves out front by being there attract all sorts of others. And I saw it in the Occupy movement in Boston, where you had lots of community-based organizations, lots of statewide advocacy groups, lots of philanthropists get together, join the marches to the Occupy site and then to the State House.
Yeah, but the thing about that
allowed them to pull together public policy in the last year and a half that really has been much more progressive and impacting state legislation.
Right, and I think, as I was suggesting about Rio and other places too, it's not just that you have the NGOs and these people who haven't met, it's that you meet people who are you presumed with whom you had no common cause. But that was what was really interesting about going to Zuccotti. You saw the guys coming out of the office buildings, you saw people who were civil servants, you saw mothers, and I mean you just saw a lot of different people who were not just all the guys sleeping in tents overnight. It was that sense of people who you wouldn't expect necessarily to have shared overlapping interests, who were able to see each other physically, that created the possibility for those coalitions.
And that's what I meant also. Foment that.
Right, and that's also what I meant about change in places like Penn Station. You need to have coalitions of people who realize they have shared interests. They may be transit people who have their interests, and architectures, people who have their interests, and so forth. Developers have their interests. They need to see those things as overlapping interests. I don't want to end wrongly about the GSD, by the way. I mean, but this also came up at lunch, and it's very important to say. I think most architects now, and I think most people who teach architecture in schools like this, are concerned with these issues. I don't think that it's true. I don't know where the question was that architects are not. I don't believe that at all. But I think the idea of creating a culture that sees architecture as having a wider role, that's the goal, and schools play a part in doing that and sending people out into the world who feel empowered to act. So thank you very much.